Shove 4 rounds down of the championship. Let's look back at the Russian Grand Prix. A safety car appearing early on in the race. What did that do to people's strategy?
Well, I mean, at the front, it didn't really change much. It's so early on. So if it had been lap 10, you might have seen people trying something different, like taking a soft tyre to the end from there. But so early on, you don't want to lose the track position if you're at the front. So as expected, we all stayed out. The only interesting things from that were really at the back. The Saubers, also Van Dorn in the McLaren, they came in and they got rid of their super soft tyres and went to the Ultra. And what they were effectively doing was from there, what looked like a one-stop with two Ultra tyres, just because it's a quicker tyre. It was better than the super soft.
So we have the safety car out for 3 laps. After the safety car appeared, Lewis started talking about some overheating that he was feeling. What caused that and how did it affect his race?
Well, we were a bit caught out by the weather. We'd been expecting it to be about 23 degrees. Sunday morning, the forecast was for 24, and we were actually seeing more like 26. So the cooling we had on the car for the race was insufficient, really. It was fine for Valtteri. He was up the front in free air. But for Lewis, it's when you lose the clean air and you're in dirty air from the car in front, it all runs hotter. And we were having to get him to just back off, pull out of the tow, but also just keep that gap. So we couldn't really let him attack Kimi properly.
If we look up in the top left-hand corner shelf, we can see predicted pit strategies. No one in the top 10 was really jumping for a pit stop. Why was that?
Well, it was a very strange race, partly because the tyres were so consistent. So you didn't have this degradation that normally pulls you in. It's normally quite sudden and you've got no option but to stop. But also, it was weird because everyone had each other at arm's length. The gaps were such that there was no point in attempting an undercut because if you stopped, the other guy could cover it easily without any stress. So you saw this with Lewis and Kimi, for instance. If we'd stopped, Kimi would have just reacted and we wouldn't have gained anything. The other factor was that people were just waiting for that safety car if it came. Because if we'd stopped Valtteri, and in fact when we did stop Valtteri, if there had been a safety car the lap after or a VSC, then Sebastian could have done a quicker stop because we're running around under that slower delta lap, and he would have ended up in front and won the race. So it was really covering the risk, but it was quite strange to get such a long period where no one was reacting. It was a bit of a Mexican standoff. And you'd have heard us saying to Valtteri, it'll be another 3 laps, and then we added another 5 laps to his stop. Just going further and further, really, because the tyres were hanging on and there was no reason to come in.
So when the pit stops did start to happen, we were on lap 27 for Valtteri. But then Sebastian Vettel managing to keep his tyres on until lap 34, so much longer. Why did those 2 strategies evolve?
Well, for Valtteri, we were starting to see a bit of degradation. He'd been pushing hard early on to try and get the gap. And also, we'd been telling him, one stop lap, and then we'd gone further and further and further. So eventually the tyres will always come to the end of their life. That was one factor, and also there was a lot of traffic out there, and it was quite hard to get through this traffic. So with Valtteri, we were a bit worried that this gap that he'd worked so hard to build up in the early phase was going to start to shrink quite a lot as we were hitting the traffic with the older tyres. So we came in, but then you said Vettel stayed out. Well, that's back to this point about the safety car. So what he's doing there is just banking on the fact that if there is a safety car, he's got a shorter pit stop. He would have dropped in front of Valtteri and he would have won the race from there. So it's all just to do with that balance of risk. But his tyres were holding on. There was no real reason for him to react to us at the time. Now, the other thing he achieved was obviously the fresher rubber at the end of the race. So those 7-lap newer tyres, you could see, allowed him to really make inroads into Valtteri's gap.
And when Valtteri did pit, we saw a very fast pit lane time from Bottas. That obviously all helps.
Yeah, I mean, it was one of those days where every 1/10 of a second was crucial. You saw how close it was at the end of the race. So we're all there hoping that we're going to get a good stop. I mean, it was a fantastic stop, the fastest of the day. So it really came at the right time. But the guys do so much practice and so much refining the process to try and do this when it really matters. So very pleasing to see.
So Valtteri had a rather large lockup on lap 38. We can see it, lap 38 here, but the crucial thing being that Vettel had only just stopped. So how much pressure did Valtteri put himself under with that lockup?
Well, I mean, maybe we were putting him under a bit of pressure because we could see Sebastian's times and we were giving him those lap times. So he's obviously pushing, you know, again, it all comes down to every tenth of a second, and we knew that Sebastian would close in on us on fresher rubber. And he lost about a second there. You saw afterwards, he actually said, right guys, can we just cut down the messages? So once he could see Sebastian, it doesn't really help if he's got engineers in his ear giving him all those lap times. He knows fine well what he's got to do. But it's a tricky braking zone, the car's loaded, it's very easy to grab a wheel. And as well as the time you lose with that mistake, that tyre starts vibrating, it's got a bit of a flat spot, and it just loses a bit of grip with that. It's a bit harder for the driver to see. It affects their rhythm and the feeling of the car. So it wasn't ideal, but if you looked at his day, it was, you know, the only one small mistake, and in the end he got away with it anyway.
And in that last part of the race, Valtteri and Vettel both having to deal with back markers. How difficult was that for them both?
I mean, it was difficult. We were obviously trying to make sure we could stay out of Sebastian's DRS zone. We didn't want him getting on the back of us. And the other thing is when you're trying to negotiate that traffic, if the two cars are tucked up one behind the other, then cars tend to let them through together. And in those situations, it can all get, a mess, you can get tangled up, and Valtteri would have been vulnerable. But it was difficult. Valtteri lost a lot of time as well getting through, and you've got to get within a second before they get the blue flag now. And that's actually harder than it sounds, because again, with a consistent rubber, a lot of these cars were actually quite quick, and it's difficult to close right up.
We saw Kimi Räikkönen come in on lap 29, swiftly followed by Lewis Hamilton on lap 30. And although it was only a lap's difference, you might think that Lewis's tyres would be fresher and therefore he could catch up with Räikkönen, but he didn't seem to turn it on. What was the problem?
Well, we were giving Lewis Kimi's lap times. Kimi was going very well on that super soft tyre. Lewis knew about the issues with overheating. He knew that whenever he got tucked up behind another car, we were telling him to back off and to pull out of the tow and cool the car. So Lewis just came on to us when he knew how quick Kimi was and said, look guys, I may as well just save the engine a bit here because it's a long season and you want to keep the power unit as fresh as you possibly can. There was still another strategy that was in our minds with Lewis, which was making sure we had a safety car gap to Verstappen. So if the safety car did come out, he was far enough away from Verstappen he could make a free stop, so come and get fresh rubber. And if Kimi didn't react to that, then it would have given us another chance. Being on fresh tyres at the end of the race, we could have attacked. So that was really all there was, and as it happens, there were no opportunities for Lewis at all, so it was just a day for consolidating position and looking after the car.
If we look at the top 10's tyre strategy, we can see that everyone ran the ultra soft, then the super soft, but if you look at Nico Hülkenberg's, he's managed to make that ultra soft work very, very, very long into the race. Did that surprise you?
I mean, it was a surprise how far he'd gone. If you looked at as the race as it evolved, you could understand why he wasn't stopping. He wasn't really losing a lot of time to anyone. So he was able to run around the same times as the cars that had already pitted. And what he was trying to do was look after it and then be on fresher rubber at the end. Again, if there's a safety car, you've got better tyres, you can attack at the restart. He was also able to close down Ocon. He dropped out about 5 seconds behind, and he was able to close up in those final stages using that fresher rubber. But it's quite difficult to overtake if you haven't got a big lap time difference. So again, it didn't really pay off for him, but there was no downside, and you're just trying to offset yourself to the other cars.
Thanks so much, Shav. We move on now to the Europeans. Next stop, Spain.
Thank you very much.